readings from the diaries to give you a sense of my great-great-grandmother, since she was such an important part of at least my understanding. I've heard it suggested that God might have invented people because God liked good stories. I've certainly found that in studying these diaries, I've enjoyed the story of my great-great-grandmother. I've felt a deep connection to her words, and certainly she's in a part of my DNA and flows through me. Nancy McDougall Robinson was born in Canada in 1808. Her family moved from New York to Mississippi, where her father was a judge. She was a very sensitive and idealistic woman. This first entry I'll read is very interesting, given that it was written when she was the age of 23, and it's written by someone who's a future slave owner. But it does show a current throughout her life, which was her kindness. September 20th, 1832. The ways of providence are mysterious. Would it but favor the brave, the generous, the kind? Could I be rich, no one should want while I had it in my power to bestow. I would give to the homeless child of want. My coffers would be open to the destitute. How can the children of dissipation behold the misery of their fellow creatures without pain to alleviate their suffering, to cheer the dying moments of those who are friendless, to dry the tear from the cheek of misery and dispense happiness? Such would be the wish of the kind-hearted. Nancy turned 24 and Alfred was 25 when they married. December 31st, 1832, Port Gibson, Mississippi. This is perhaps the most eventful day of my life. Today I quit this stage of action. I wish all my friends to be present, and will none be here, to see me in bridal pomp and gaiety, but in meek submission promise what I hope to perform. Mr. Robinson and I are to be married today and leave after one day for his home. And I'll mention that it seemed to be common for wives of that time to refer to their husbands as Mr. Robinson or Mr. R. It wasn't a sign of distance. After the wedding, Nancy and Alfred rode off on horseback to the Chicopa Plantation, Mississippi. It was very painful for her to leave her family. She was very close to her family. Yet she also loved her husband very dearly, which is evident throughout her diaries. Overall, during the whole time that relates to slavery, before the Civil War, during the Civil War, she doesn't write a lot about the slaves. She writes some about the Christmas celebrations, the 4th of July celebrations, the marriages in the big house of the plantation owner, or the quarters, the slave quarters. She doesn't write anything that I could find about the treatment of slaves or their living conditions. On one hand, it could be like it's an invisible fabric that holds together the life of an aristocrat. But she did write in that entry we had in the first part that she was glad the slaves were free. So it's also possible that there were things that disturbed her that she didn't feel comfortable putting in writing because it was too taboo. Unfortunately, I'll never know the answer to that one. But she did clearly experience suffering when they suffered, and she spent a lot of time taking care of sick slaves as well as sick family members. She could have been a nurse if she'd had a profession. This next entry refers to the separating of slaves when slaves are taken from one plantation to another. And of course that, just as on the auction block, was a time when husbands and wives were separated, parents and children, brothers and sisters. December 16th, 1841. A day of sadness truly has passed, yes, of grief and reality. the separation of brothers, the parting of friends, of parents and children, the grief and lamentation of the Negroes at leaving, where Jerry started for the Louisiana place with some of the people. The subject of death is a common theme. People died of cholera, yellow fever, pneumonia. It seemed like whole towns were wiped out sometimes. Something we can't even imagine in this day and era. April 19th, 1851. Sorrows, afflictions, and troubles crowd before me, for it seems bereavements will never cease. My mother, brother, aunt, uncle, niece, cousin, brother-in-law, all dead in 1 year. This next entry is of note to those of us that live in the gold country. July 14th, 1853. We've had company to dinner, a friend from California who showed us pieces of gold he dug from the earth himself, George Powell. She was a spiritualist, which holds the belief that one can communicate with deceased loved ones through a medium. This next entry probably relates to something that reinforced that belief for her. March 15th, 1855. Mr. Robinson told me of dreaming of Mr. Shepherd, of seeing him, their conversation, and he bid him farewell. Mr. R. awoke, got up and looked at his watch. It was 1:30 o'clock. He was grieved, for he believed Mr. Shepherd was dead. 3 days later. March 18th, 1855. Rode to Dr. Fisher's in the evening and heard of Mr. Shepherd's death. He died the hour Mr. Robinson dreamed Mr. Shepherd bid him farewell. Buying slaves was discussed, sometimes with a casualness like buying furniture or another piece of property. September 24th, 1858, Richmond, Virginia. Today is cool. We have a fire in the grate, for Mr. R. complains of being chilly. In the evening, he went out with Jerry to buy some more slaves to bring home, while I write June Baldwin and Douglas. If you remember that receipt we just saw a few minutes ago, it was from this same day, September 24th, 1858. When slaves were mentioned, slave deaths was a common theme. As I mentioned, she could have been a nurse. She was often nursing sick slaves. February 5th, 1859. Tonight, with a weary heart, I look back to the past week and think of the 25 sick we have nursed and their condition. 2 have died and 3 are very low. April 24th, 1859. We have now lost 40 of our good servants since August, 8 months' time. A sad loss. This next reading is an excerpt from a speech by Alexander Stephens, the Vice President of the Confederacy, March of 1861. After he said that slavery was the cause for the Southern states seceding and forming the Confederacy, he goes on to say, and I quote, "Our new government is founded, its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition." And offer that to anybody that believes that the Confederate flag, which represented the Confederacy, doesn't relate to racism or white supremacy, or shouldn't be offensive to not just black people, to any other American. The war was described as a rich person's war fought by poor people. It was fought certainly to a degree in defense of slavery. Yet most Southerners didn't own slaves. In fact, 1.5 years after the war started, the Confederacy allowed an exemption for soldiers who owned a certain amount of slaves to go home, which is how my great-grandfather, Jerry, my great-grandmother's son, was freed from service. So the brunt of the war fell on poor people, as war often seems to do. And the war was hell. Raise your hand if you saw the Ken Burns series on the Civil War. I thought that covered it very well. Gave you at least a good idea. Return to the diary entries. April 21st through 23rd, 1861. There's much uneasiness now with regard to our political dissensions. President Lincoln has issued his proclamation that all the secession states come into the Union again, or he will force them back. He now has 70,000 armed men at the city of Washington ready for his orders. His war vessels are around the southern coast. The secessionists will not go back without the proposed amendments to their laws and must now contend against the armies of Lincoln. Our state calls for men to assist in this trial for ourselves. Jerry has left me this evening. He goes to Jackson, commissioned to see the governor for the company formed in this neighborhood with regard to arms and orders. July 15th, 1861. Our soldiers left this morning for the camp, and my company of ladies went in the carriage and buggy at 10. Mr. Helm addressed the company, the Sunflower Guards for Sunflower County, and presented them with a banner. The dancing began. I went to see the dance and found both my sons were dancing happily. How long, I asked myself, can they be so happy? These sad times when our country is in a struggle for peace on earth. The time is uncertain. After the festivity was over, I went with Mr. Wells to the camp where we were invited to see them drill and perform mock battle. I saw the company in their heavy uniforms go through their exercises in double quick time, and the exertion and weariness they showed grieved me. Dear children of the South, raised tenderly. Next, we have a letter that was written by my great-great-aunt to my great-great-grandmother. There are a couple ways you can relate to this letter. On one hand, it's a picture of human suffering, people who are experiencing a great loss. Perhaps some of us can identify with that. It's a human tragedy. On another hand, you can also relate to it as perhaps what people deserved who had slaves and slave plantations. Or maybe a mixture of both. I'll leave that to you. Port Gibson, Mississippi, June the 26th, 1863. Dear Sister Nancy, I sit down to write you a few lines, not knowing whether this will reach you. I know you must be anxious in regard to us, but have had no opportunity to write you with any expectation that you would receive a letter. We've not heard from you for a long time and would like to know what has become of you. The Yankees, as you're aware, came here and fought General Bimmers at the Schaefer and Buck plantations the 2nd of May, 35,000 against 7,000. Our forces retreated and burned the bridge over the bayou and escaped. The town was occupied by the Yankees, who behaved as well as other thieves, merely taking all they wanted and destroying what they did not want. They've literally ruined the best half of the county and taken thousands of Negroes away. I have not one slave worth a cent on the Dotson place and but 12 hands on the Hiro Sims place. All or nearly all of our stock, wagons, etc., and even my old toothbrush have been stolen. 175 Negroes have been taken off from the places which I control. My town Negroes all remained except for Argyle, the last one I expected to leave me. All of David McDougall's Negroes left him. Mrs. Ann McDougall and only Mary and child. Kennard Shreve and Mrs. Hoops lost all. Mrs. Sessions, all. Mrs. McAlpine, all. Mrs. Valentine and Mrs. Crane, nearly all. All along the road to Rocky Springs has been cleaned out. The Davenport estate and Shields places are ruined. Mrs. Daniels, etc. It's sickening to add it up. If we gain Vicksburg and defeat them, and I believe we will get many of them back. All except the men are put on plantations on the other side of the river above Vicksburg, and we may get back those who don't die from exposure. Sarah's Negroes are all here. Wish to God she had them. I wrote her long ago. They take Negroes whether they wish to go or not, to my certain knowledge. They have a gunboat stationed in the Gulf and make raids into the surrounding country when they please. There are more in Jefferson County, robbing and plundering. When this will end, God only knows. I'm ruined by all appearances and have lost not less than $150,000. I will go to Mrs. Valentine's tomorrow. Mr. V is dead. They stole all their provisions wherever they went. Write to me. The mail is expected this evening, but may not come. Yours truly, S. My great-great-aunt's hope for a victory at Vicksburg did not come true. About a week after this letter, the siege of Vicksburg resulted in the surrender of Vicksburg on July 4th, 1863. Because that happened on July 4th, that city did not celebrate a July 4th for 81 years. At the end of this next entry, she expresses the pain of war, but she also expresses her view of the master-slave relationship, which to us is very hard to understand or imagine that someone could have these beliefs, but these were very sincere beliefs that people had, as unfortunate as they were. February 26, 1865. By sorrow of the heart, the spirit is broken. I think Mr. Lincoln can make no atonement to heaven or earth for the sorrow and suffering his sins has caused this continent. He cares not for the thousands of helpless women and children he has robbed and left in poverty and want, yes, starving. He has no thought for the sin of arming the slaves to fight against those that served and protected them. Interesting perspective. But that's what some people believed. May the 9th, 1865. Douglas came with a shout, said the war was over, and we're again in the Union. All our forces on this side of the Mississippi River were surrendered. He said the Yankee boats were running the river as they once did before the war, that they offered to trade, etc. The news astonished me, but it must be true. This entry was May the 9th. General Robert E. Lee actually surrendered a month before at Appomattox. It took a month for that news to get to Mississippi. May 12th, 1865. I feel a relief I cannot describe at the war being ended, and a horror just as deep at going into the Union with the people of the South who's risked their lives to get from. The terms of surrender we do not know, but cannot expect any justice or mercy from them that have none. Our table is spread to the furthest extent for our guests. Soldiers are here, poor noble soldiers of the South. After the Civil War, 1/5 of the state budget went to artificial limbs. May the 29th, 1865. The Yankees have proclaimed our Negroes free and will try to confiscate our lands. They have robbed and ruined the people for revenge, which is ours. They have robbed me of $65,000 worth of Negro property, I left my lands youthless, to me I fear. Her poems often reflect pain and sorrow, as you can perhaps imagine, for someone who goes through the experience of war. July 26, 1868. There is a crop of heavy weight for every human life to bear. There is a chaplet formed of thorns for each and every brow to wear. And after the war, there were dangerous times. There were black people and white people that were creating unrest throughout the South. September 14th, 1869, Colonel McLemore rode to the gate. He said there was trouble for 200 Negroes that congregated at the Archer Plantation in Sunflower County. On Saturday, 80 mounted Negro men with flags and horns, armed with guns, sabers, pistols, some with large knives, rode from Boyd's store to Mr. Mentor's. There they shot many times without aim. October 16th, 1869. Mrs. Martha Reading and Lily Collier with Carrie called for a few minutes to see me and urged me to go home with them. 2 white men on horseback came in sight, but delayed until the ladies left. They then rode in at the lower gate, left their horses. I soon saw them, and they passed a house with Peter Sykes, a freedman, going before them. They had guns drawn on them and were heavily armed with pistols and knives. They broke the doors and searched all, breaking locks and doors. I went out when I saw them going to break a door and forbade it. One answered they had a right to do it. I asked him on whose authority. He said he would give me a receipt. They were drunk. This entry was written 3.5 years before her death, and it's one of my favorites. May the 8th, 1870. I feel humbled, yes, and thankful for many blessings that I may not deserve. I went to see our tenants, Mrs. Stewart and Screws, for Mr. Screws has gone to Calhoun County. I walked to see the families. They were all well, but distressed at not hearing preaching. How could they be saved? They could not read the Bible. They were out of reach of a preacher. How could they keep the Sabbath? I told them that I believed God was love and light, that He rested not on the 7th day, but every day was holy. No wrong should be done. God's work never ceased. He grows corn and trees and flowers every day. We are the children of God. Jesus said He is our brother, and they that live faithful lives are joint heirs with Him. That punishment was the remorse of conscience, that we only need salvation from ignorance, error, selfishness, bigotry, poverty, intemperance, and unrighteousness. Her husband, who died in 1858, and her children were very, very close to her. This next entry is about her children. April 20th, 1873. I rose this morning with renewed hope, for I saw some firmness of purpose in the son I love. May he be able to keep it. I love both my children dearly. They are my treasures, yet they little know of my troubles for them. This was written on her 64th birthday, about a year before her death. November 27th, 1872. I do not dread the closing scenes of my earthly life, though my sun is nearing the western horizon. More than 80 years have been numbered since light dawned upon my existence. I rise each morning to do my duty with cheerfulness of heart and hope for the future each year. I feel my love and charity for others, more sacrifice for all. The many changes in life of joy and sorrow hath made my dear ones dearer to my heart. I love them for their causes their sorrows, and their trials. This final entry I will share was written 9.5 months before her death, March 15th, 1873. Life is a torrid day, burned by the wind and sun, and death the calm, cool evening hour when the weary day is done. Nancy Robertson died on December 29th, 1873, shortly before her 65th birthday.